What many people call a soul tie is often not a mystical chain at all, but an experience that remained active because it was never fully met. A connection happened, something in the body opened, something in the heart attached meaning to it. And then the experience moved on before the person did. The mind names that lingering charge a bond because it can still feel the other person somewhere inside its field of attention. But what remains is not always the person. Many times it is the unprocessed impact of what the connection awakened. This is why some people can leave a relationship and feel clear within weeks, while others feel haunted for years by a connection that was shorter, weaker, or less loving. The difference is rarely explained by romance alone. It is usually explained by what the connection touched, what it activated, and whether the person had the capacity to metabolize what rose afterward. If an encounter stirred abandonment, longing, validation hunger, shame, relief, fantasy, grief, or the ache of finally being seen, then the experience did more than happen in time. It entered structure. Once something enters structure, it does not disappear because the event is over. It continues showing up in perception, in desire, in memory, and in the way new people are interpreted. This is why someone can say they miss a person, when what they actually miss is the version of themselves that briefly came alive around them. Sometimes they are not bound to the other person at all. They are bound to an unfinished internal event that keeps replaying because the nervous system, the emotions, and the self-image never came back into coherence after the contact ended. That is where distortion begins to make more sense than superstition. Distortion is not simply pain. Distortion is what happens when pain, desire, fantasy, and memory start blending together until the person can no longer clearly tell what they are responding to. They think they are responding to destiny, but they may be responding to deprivation. They think they are feeling sacred recognition, but they may be feeling the intensity of an unmet pattern finally being stimulated. Intensity is one of the easiest things in human life to misread as truth. This does not mean every deep connection is false. It means depth alone is not proof of clarity. A person can feel pulled, obsessed, emotionally pierced, sexually imprinted, unable to move on, and still not be in contact with truth. They may be in contact with activation. Activation feels powerful because it generates energy, focus, and meaning all at once. But energy is not the same as integration, and meaning is not always the same as reality. A useful question is not, are soul ties real? But what exactly is still active in me? That question changes everything because it moves the attention away from myth and back toward mechanism. Is it grief that was never allowed to complete? Is it a wound that found temporary relief and now wants to return to the source that softened it? Is it a fragmented sense of worth that attached itself to the one who seemed to confirm it? Once the question becomes more honest, the experience becomes easier to read. This is why repeated intimacy without reflection creates such confusion in people. Every encounter leaves some trace, but not every trace becomes distortion. Distortion grows when a person keeps overriding their own emotional reality in order to stay in motion. They tell themselves they are fine, detached, evolved, casual, unbothered, or just having fun, while the deeper layers of them keep absorbing unfinished experience. Eventually, the field becomes crowded with impressions that were felt but never sorted, received but never understood, carried but never cleared. When that happens, attachment stops being readable in a simple way. The person may think they are drawn to someone new, but part of what they are feeling is residue from someone old. They may feel numb in one moment and overwhelming craving in the next because multiple unfinished signals are operating at the same time. They may start mistaking anxiety for chemistry, inconsistency for magnetism, and emotional volatility for proof that something significant is happening. This is not because they are weak. It is because their internal signal is no longer clean. A clean signal does not mean a person never feels deeply. It means they can feel deeply without losing interpretive clarity. They can notice attraction without turning it into prophecy. They can feel attachment without immediately building identity around it. They can feel loss without converting the loss into a spiritual story that keeps them loyal to what has already ended. Clarity does not remove feeling. It prevents feeling from becoming a false authority. This is where many people struggle. because they think processing means suppressing less or expressing more. But real integration is more specific than that. Integration means allowing an experience to reveal what it actually touched, so that the charge is no longer forced to travel forward disguised as intuition, preference, or fate. If a connection opened abandonment, then abandonment must be seen. If it opened loneliness, then loneliness must be seen. If it opened a desperate need to be chosen, then that need must be seen before the person can claim they are simply following their heart. Otherwise, the heart is not leading. The wound is leading with the heart's vocabulary, and that matters because wounds are fluent in urgency. They know how to make a person feel that something must be pursued now, resolved now, recovered now, repeated now. The unintegrated system does not usually sound chaotic from the inside. It often sounds convincing. That is why so many people defend the very patterns that are fragmenting them. You can watch this happen in simple ways. A person keeps going back to someone who destabilizes them and calls it a deep bond. Another cannot stop thinking about an encounter that barely had substance, because what they are really replaying is how alive, desired, or visible they felt during it. Another moves rapidly from one connection to another, insisting that they are free, while becoming less capable of stillness, less capable of discernment, and more dependent on external contact to regulate internal emptiness. In each case, the language may sound spiritual or romantic, but the mechanism is often unintegrated experience seeking resolution through repetition. Repetition feels tempting because the system assumes that returning to a similar experience might finally finish what the earlier one left open. But repetition without awareness rarely resolves anything. It usually deepens the groove. The person keeps meeting different faces inside the same unfinished pattern, then calling each one profound because the feeling returns with force. Yet the return of a pattern is not proof of destiny. Often it is proof of structure. This is why time alone does not heal what has not been understood. People say they gave it time, but time only helps what is being metabolized while it passes. If the person keeps rehearsing the same fantasy, defending the same attachment, or refusing to name what actually happened, then time can strengthen distortion instead of dissolving it. Years can pass, and the person can still be living in reaction to a moment that was never consciously integrated. Time changes distance. It does not automatically change structure. What changes structure is honest contact with reality. Not the dramatic version, not the spiritually flattering version, not the one that protects the ego from embarrassment, but the plain version. What did I want here? What did I ignore here? What did I feel but refuse to admit? What part of me attached itself to this? And why did it need to? These questions are not cold. They are merciful, because they return power to the place where distortion began. Once a person begins to do that, the idea of a soul tie starts becoming less rigid and more readable. There may indeed be meaningful energetic exchanges between people, and some connections do leave unusually deep imprints. But even then, the imprint must still be interpreted well. A strong imprint can be a lesson, a mirror, a catalyst, a threshold, an initiation into self-knowledge, or a confrontation with an unhealed layer. It is not automatically a sign that the bond should continue simply because its effects were intense. That shift in understanding changes how a person lives. They stop asking only who they are tied to and begin asking what within them still needs to come home. They become less fascinated by the mystery of the other person and more devoted to cleaning the distortions inside their own field. They notice that much of what once felt like spiritual confusion was actually emotional backlog. And when that backlog starts clearing, attraction becomes easier to read. Love becomes less entangled with hunger, and discernment stops feeling like denial. Then something quieter begins to emerge. The person no longer needs every powerful experience to mean forever, and no longer needs every lingering feeling to mean they belong to someone. They start to recognize that what remains in them after connection is a form of information. Some of it points toward genuine resonance. Some of it points toward unresolved pain. Some of it points toward the places where they abandoned themselves in order to feel chosen, merged, relieved, or less alone. And the more accurately they learn to read that information, the less likely they are to hand sacred language to patterns that were only asking to be understood. You may notice that once this becomes visible, the question of cleansing someone else's energy starts losing some of its power, not because energy is irrelevant, but because the deeper issue is often not contamination. It is continuity. An experience continues inside a person because it found open pathways in memory, emotion, desire, and identity, and kept moving through them long after the external contact ended. What feels like someone staying in your field is often your own unresolved structure continuing to circulate around what they represented. That matters because people often attempt spiritual solutions for what are actually interpretive and emotional problems. They perform rituals, cord cuttings, prayers, fasts, affirmations, and declarations, yet still feel pulled back into the same charge. Then they assume the tie must be especially strong. But if the underlying mechanism was never understood, the ritual can only interrupt the surface expression for a moment. The pattern returns because the structure that generated the attachment was not dissolved, only briefly quieted. This is why insight matters more than dramatic release. A person can cry, purge, shake, delete the messages, block the number, burn the photos, and still remain inwardly entangled if the meaning of the connection is still intact inside them. Meaning is adhesive. It binds far more strongly than contact alone. If the person still believes this connection proved their worth, denied their worth, represented the love they always wanted, or symbolized the life they think they missed, then the internal bond stays active regardless of physical distance. You can see this clearly in how memory behaves. Some memories fade because they were fully lived and then completed. Others repeat because the mind is still trying to solve something through them. The replay is not random. It is the psyche returning to unfinished material and asking in its own way, can this be understood now? Can this be reinterpreted now? Can this finally be brought into coherence? Memory often repeats not to torture a person, but to seek resolution. Yet if memory keeps returning, and the person keeps romanticizing the return, then the repetition gets misread. They stop asking why this still hurts and start saying this must mean something cosmic. They stop examining the structure and start protecting the story. Once that happens, they can become loyal to their own distortion. They may feel spiritual for honoring the bond, when in truth they are preserving an inner arrangement that keeps them emotionally suspended between what happened and what they still wish had happened. This is one of the most important distinctions to make. There is a difference between honoring what a connection awakened and remaining bound to the connection itself. Honoring means learning from it, letting it reveal you to yourself, allowing it to clarify your patterns, your needs, your blind spots, your capacities, and your thresholds. Bondage means organizing your inner life around it long after its function has been served. One turns experience into wisdom. The other turns experience into a shrine. A shrine is subtle because it does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like comparison. Every new person is measured against one old feeling. Sometimes it looks like delay. A person avoids new intimacy because they are still silently loyal to an unfinished attachment. Sometimes it looks like overreach. They keep assigning depth, destiny, or spiritual significance to new interactions because they have trained themselves to experience activation as revelation. In each case, the person thinks they are protecting something sacred, but they may be protecting an unprocessed impression from being reinterpreted. This also explains why some people keep feeling that the same type of person enters their life under different names. They say, I keep meeting the same energy, and in a sense they do, but not because the universe is mocking them or because some external force keeps sending them punishment. They keep meeting structures they still cannot fully see. What remains unresolved becomes perceptually magnetic. The mind, the emotions, and the body orient toward what feels familiar, and familiarity is often mistaken for alignment. Familiarity can feel incredibly convincing because it creates instant recognition. The person seems easy to read, even when they are not good for you. The pattern feels charged, even when it is not healthy. The internal system says yes quickly because the terrain is known. But known is not the same as nourishing. Known may simply mean that an old wound has found another compatible surface on which to continue expressing itself. This is where the subject becomes less about other people and more about self-contact. If a person does not know what loneliness feels like in their own body, they will confuse relief with love. If they do not know what abandonment fear feels like in real time, they will confuse intermittent attention with sacred intensity. If they do not know how validation hunger moves through their choices, they will confuse being chosen with being seen. The inner illiteracy becomes the outer distortion. The opposite of distortion is not detachment. It is readability. A readable inner life allows a person to know what is moving before it acquires too much story. They can feel desire and ask what it is attached to. They can feel grief and ask what is actually being lost. They can feel obsession and ask what unfinished meaning it is carrying. They can feel chemistry and remain curious rather than surrendering interpretation too quickly. Readability does not make life less deep. It makes depth less dangerous. You may also notice that once readability increases, the emotional after effects of connection become more instructive. Instead of asking only whether the connection was real, the person begins to observe what reality it produced in them. Did it leave them clearer or more fragmented? More honest or more performative? More grounded in themselves or more dependent on another person's attention to feel coherent? The aftermath reveals the mechanism more accurately than the intensity of the moment ever could. This is important because many people evaluate connection by peak feeling rather than consequence. They judge depth by how hard they fell, not by what the bond cultivated in them over time. But consequence is where truth becomes visible. A bond that repeatedly leaves a person less honest, less regulated, less self-respecting, less discerning, and more addicted to ambiguity is teaching something very different from what the fantasy says. The lesson may still be valuable, but not for the reason the person first assumed. And this is where the idea of integration returns at a deeper level. Integration is not merely taking a break between relationships or spending time alone. Those things can help, but they are not the essence of it. Integration means allowing what was activated to become conscious enough that it no longer needs to control behavior from underneath awareness. A person is integrating when they can feel the charge, name the pattern, understand the meaning, and choose without being quietly driven by what remains unresolved. That is why true integration often feels less glamorous than spiritual language suggests. It may look like admitting that the connection was meaningful but not aligned. It may look like admitting that what felt rare was actually familiar in a damaging way. It may look like grieving not the person, but the internal fantasy that lived around them. It may look like giving up the flattering idea that every intense bond was a sign of destiny, and replacing it with a more mature understanding that some bonds arrive to expose structure, not fulfill it. When a person starts doing this, their relationship to longing changes. Longing no longer automatically points outward. Sometimes it points inward toward neglected parts of self that were projected onto another person and then pursued there. Sometimes it points backward toward grief that was never fully metabolized. Sometimes it points downward into the body, where the nervous system still associates certain dynamics with the possibility of love because those dynamics were imprinted early. Longing stops being a command and becomes a form of information. Once longing becomes information, discernment gets stronger without becoming cold. The person can stay open without becoming porous. They can respect the impact of connection without surrendering to every story that impact tries to generate. They can feel when someone has touched them deeply and still pause long enough to ask what exactly was touched. That pause is not distance from truth. Very often, it is the first sign that truth has become more important than intensity. And from there, another layer becomes visible. Many of the bonds people call spiritual traps are actually mirrors of how little room they have made to stay with themselves once activation begins. The problem is not simply that another person stirred them. The problem is that they were never taught how to remain present when strong feeling. Fantasy, fear, desire, and memory all rise at once, so they externalize the event. They say the other person has power over them, when much of the work is learning how not to abandon themselves in the presence of their own activation. That changes the whole frame. The work becomes less about escaping human contact and more about becoming sturdy enough to interpret contact clearly. It becomes less about fearing deep connection and more about building enough inner coherence to survive it without distortion. It becomes less about finding people who never trigger anything and more about becoming someone who can recognize the difference between resonance and reenactment. That difference is subtle at first, but once seen, it reorganizes almost everything. And so the question keeps evolving. Not only are soul ties real, but what within us turns contact into continuity, continuity into identity, and identity into loyalty long after the lesson has shifted shape. Because once that movement becomes visible, a person begins to sense that the real threshold was never merely in who they touched or who touched them, but in the hidden way experience becomes self, and self begins shaping what kind of love can even be recognized. If that hidden movement becomes easier to see, then the work stops being about proving whether a bond was spiritual and starts becoming about learning what kind of self was built around it. That is a quieter question, but it reaches further. A person may discover that what they called devotion was sometimes fear of emptiness with a noble name. They may discover that what they called deep intuition was often pattern memory moving faster than discernment. They may also discover that some connections truly did matter, but not because they were meant to be kept forever. This is one of the more difficult shifts for the human mind. The mind wants significance to guarantee permanence. It assumes that if something changed you deeply, then it must also be meant to stay with you in its original form. But life does not work that way. Some experiences are significant because they interrupt an old structure, reveal a hidden hunger, expose a distortion, or awaken a capacity that would not have emerged without impact. Their importance is real, yet their purpose may still be temporary. When this is not understood, people become confused by the difference between imprint and alignment. An imprint is what remains because something entered deeply into your system. Alignment is what remains coherent when truth, timing, character, and consequence are all considered together. These are not the same thing. A person can leave a profound imprint on you because they reached a part of you no one else had touched, while still being profoundly misaligned with what your life, dignity, and inner clarity require. That distinction can feel almost offensive at first, because the human heart often wants intensity to be rewarded. It wants the depth of feeling to mean that the connection deserves continuation. But feeling does not create fitness. It only reveals activation. Whether that activation becomes love, growth, damage, dependency, wisdom, or distortion depends on what kind of structure it enters and how it is met once it arrives. This is why two people can live through the same kind of bond and be changed in completely different ways. A person who has learned to stay with themselves can let a strong experience move through them without immediately turning it into doctrine. They can feel pulled and still remain observant. They can admit, "This touched me deeply," without assuming, "Therefore it owns me, completes me, or defines my path." That ability changes the whole quality of relating. It allows contact to be meaningful without becoming tyrannical. And it allows desire to be felt without being crowned as authority the moment it appears. You can often tell when someone has not yet learned this by the speed with which they assign cosmic language to emotional events. They need every powerful encounter to become a sign, a lesson, a mission, a reunion, a karmic return, a soul contract, or a test from the universe. What they usually cannot yet tolerate is the simpler possibility that the experience is meaningful because it revealed them to themselves. That kind of meaning is less dramatic, but more transformative. It places the center of gravity back inside the person instead of scattering it into story. This does not reduce the mystery of human connection. It refines it. Real mystery does not need exaggeration to remain deep. In fact, one of the clearest signs of increasing maturity is that a person can hold complexity without rushing to inflate it. They can say, "This person awakened something ancient in me, and I still need to examine whether what awakened is a source of truth, a source of pain, or a mixture of both." That sentence has more wisdom in it than most grand declarations about destiny. There is also a practical reason this matters. When people do not understand the difference between activation and alignment, they repeatedly build their lives around what destabilizes them most. They chase the strongest signal instead of the truest one. They become suspicious of calm, bored by steadiness, and emotionally dependent on ambiguity, because ambiguity keeps the imagination working. The imagination is powerful. But when it fuses with loneliness, longing, and unfinished wounds, it can turn confusion into romance with frightening efficiency. This is why healing often changes a person's taste before it changes their story. They begin to notice that what once felt magnetic now feels draining. What once felt irresistible now feels familiar in the wrong way. What once felt like impossible chemistry now reveals itself as a system of emotional hooks they no longer wish to live inside. This can feel strange because the mind may still remember the old meaning while the body is beginning to tell the truth. Growth often starts there, in the uncomfortable gap between remembered intensity and present readability. Then something even more subtle comes into view. You begin to see that every bond leaves behind not only feeling but education. Some bonds teach you where you are still vulnerable to fantasy. Some teach you how your body reacts when truth is present. Some teach you where your standards collapse under loneliness. Some teach you that your deepest wound still knows how to disguise itself as your deepest calling. And some teach you that genuine resonance becomes clearer, not murkier, the more integrated you become. So the question keeps refining itself. Not simply whether soul ties are real, not simply whether certain people stay in our field, but whether we are becoming the kind of person who can tell the difference between what remains because it is true and what remains because it was never fully understood. That distinction changes the way we remember, the way we choose, the way we grieve, and the way we love. And once that distinction starts living inside a person, they begin to feel that the deepest bond they were ever meant to restore may not have been to another person first, but to the part of themselves that can finally stay present long enough to know what any bond is actually asking of them. If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.